Michael Nolan is a lifelong martial artist with a focus on the Chinese arts, who's had more than 24 years of military service in the U.S Marine Corps, Marine Corps Reserves, and the Army National Guard. And he's on the line with us here. And I've just done something I've never done before, which is read his introduction directly off his book. Are you impressed with that?
Yeah, pretty good. Marine Corps, the
Oh, yeah.
S is silent, but yeah, it's all good. No, and I appreciate that very much.
Yeah,
Thank
kind
you.
of messed that up. So the
It's
book
okay.
is called The Natural Laws of Violence. For those that haven't read it or fell asleep during it, what is the main premise behind the book?
Well, so it basically encompasses, my observations in combat regarding the mechanics of violence and how it works, and what are the implications for that, for not only just a martial artist perspective or somebody who has answered the calling to be serving in a country's military, but really just for anybody trying to understand how that aspect of nature works. And the main premise is that simply that violence is governed by natural laws, and it's just essentially part of nature.
Yeah, and it's an interesting idea because I'd never really thought of natural laws being a thing in violence. Is this something that you just thought of one day, or have you always had it in your head?
Well, it's something that has been accepted by many cultures and societies throughout human history, but it's just not something that is regularly discussed in the West, and so it was something that I felt was appropriate, and timely to kind of emphasize. But I'm sure it'll be up for debate. Just it's something that a lot of people kind of shy away from violence, and it's not kind of a PC thing to discuss. And I get that, and I am certainly not an advocate of war whatsoever. But I do feel like for those of us that want a peaceful and healthy world, you got to understand how things work, will like it or not.
Yeah. And in terms of the actual laws, then, the first one, the wording is quite important, isn't it? It's the first person to effectively use violence will be victorious. You can correct me if I haven't got it exactly right there.
That's essentially right. Yeah, that's right. With the emphasis, so I have these keys that I talk about. The main takeaway from that one is timeliness and effectiveness. So being first and being effective. You need to be first and you need to be effective.
Yeah.
But if you have those two things, chances are you're going to be victorious.
Yeah. So say, for example, you were on a night out, whatever, and you punch someone, but then you look round and you picked on the wrong guy, and that guy punches you back, and he's won. Does that loss technically still apply because your first punch wasn't effective?
Yeah, exactly. Effectiveness is key there. So, and I do talk about that. The much beloved sucker punch, is a perfect example of that, kind of first law, and the effectiveness behind it, or the importance of effectiveness. Yeah. And that's a good example. Pick on somebody that you really had no business picking on. Yeah, things could go south real quick. Yeah.
So the effectiveness, does that just sort of mean that you have won? What is the definition of effectiveness in this context, do you think?
Yeah, well, that's actually an interesting question, insofar as it brings up the whole notion of defense. And, one of the things that I kind of realized, actually, when I started studying English boxing, actually Western boxing, the importance of really having an iron chin. It's one of those things where you can be a superior warrior, but if you can't take a punch, you're not going to win. I mean, it's that simple. And so being able to kind of suffer damage, and that's really what the nature of defense is in reality. What it does is it eliminates the effectiveness of your opponent, or the ability of your opponent to be effective with their attacks. So
yeah, and I'm just trying to think of a scenario maybe where this law wouldn't apply. Is it a 100% of the time scenario, or can there sometimes be cases where somebody could be the first to have effective violence and not be victorious?
In my experience, no. And then what it boils down to is an analysis of effectiveness. If it's truly effective, you're going to be victorious. And in those situations where one might say, well, that didn't work. Yeah, because it wasn't effective. So that's why those key elements are very, very, crucial to understanding. But even I say in my book, I'm approaching this. I'm kind of one of the first to throw it out there and say, hey, these are some of the mechanics we need to discuss as a military community. And but I certainly don't claim for it to be the end all be all. And I absolutely welcome challenges to this and refinement by militaries really across the West.
Yeah, that's the thing. In the book, you're very very honest about the fact that you might not have got it 100% right, especially with, I think it's the second law where you say that violence tends to escalate. And that's one, I guess, you can say that it isn't the case all the time.
Correct. Yeah. Especially when you have, as you pointed out, one opponent that's clearly, I don't want to say inferior, I hate using that word, but, nowhere near a match for, any given opponent. And in that case, there is no incentive for them to escalate because it's just going to go from bad to worse. And that, so, there are examples in that regarding that second law that, maybe exceptions to that where the incentives are not there. But this is one of the things I certainly appreciate you having me on your show. Absolutely. Because, I'd be, excited to hear, the UK, Mother England's take on it from their military's perspective. The West, especially the United States, rich in doctrine, and there's a lot of kind of groupthink where, we know it all. We have the dominant military, and you can't tell us otherwise. And so it's kind of hard to kind of break through that ego. And but I would hope that some of our Mother England, Sister Canada, our sister services, might be a bit more welcoming to these theories and be willing to kind of take them and move them forward.
Yeah. Why do you think it's important actually to tell people about the natural laws of violence?
Yeah. So, there, in my mind, there's two communities. There's the military community that would be of interest and then the civilian community. On the military side, kind of the most foundational elements isn't the natural laws. That's not something that's talked about in the West. It's actually what are known as the principles of war. And if you look at Western doctrine, whether it's American versus British, those two have very similar principles, but they're not the same. You look at Canada's principles of war and their military, radically different. So we're kind of all over the place. And so what I'm trying to do is take it even one step lower, one more, kind of talking, molecules. Now I'm trying to bring it down to the atomic level, maybe even the particle level, subatomic level, and say, hey, what are these very fundamental building blocks that we can then use and understand to then describe the mechanics of these higher level, physics, so to speak, using that analogy. Within the military. That's my goal within the military. Outside of the military context, the hope is that for folks, in the West, we're talking more, diplomacy, folks in the State Department, that sort of thing, and the equivalents, of our sister countries. The hope is that, diplomats with this greater understanding of the mechanics of violence can identify really perhaps better tools to use when they're addressing some of the issues that we see, in these foreign lands. And, I'll use kind of examples from both worlds. There's an obsession right now with special operating forces on the military side. They're the solution for every problem, And on the diplomatic side, it's sanctions. They love their sanctions, and the sanctions have become the solution for everything. Is that necessarily the case? The hope is with a better understanding of the mechanics of, not just violence, but really human nature, perhaps we can develop a better courses of action tailored to each individual scenario. So that's kind of the hope.
Yeah. And actually in the book as well, you talk about the fact that violence maybe shapes our world in a way, doesn't it? Because not just natural law, but law in general is based upon violence mostly because, that's the worst crime you commit. And we live in fear of violence, don't we?
Yeah. Yes. And rightfully so. I mean, again, I am not advocating, I am not a pro-violence guy at all by any stretch of the imagination. But I do make the point that, hey, this is a fundamental aspect of nature and something that we can't escape from. And so we do need to understand, not only its role within our society, but, how really it works, in order to really mitigate, the negative effects of violence, in our world. So that's kind of where I'm coming at. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that violence is a pretty bad solution to resolve an issue?
So, generally speaking, yes. But at the same time, it's important to understand that when it is appropriate, and there are times it's appropriate, it's important not to shy away from it, because it is part of nature. If you try to avoid it at all costs, at some point, you're just going to be rewarding the bully. And that does not work in the long run, right? That is not good either. So what I'm trying to help folks do is put it in its proper place. and understand when is it right, and when it is right, then understand how to engage, in its use properly.
Yeah. And you mentioned the word bully there, and there's an interesting story at the start, which is a good example where you have rich kids that wouldn't beat someone up, and then the poor kid who is muscly and all that, who could easily punch someone. So in the first example, the poor kid can easily steal the rich kid's lunch money. And then there's another example where the rich kid actually turns out to be, a ninja of some sort. He's trained in the martial arts, so he can sort of turn round and be like, actually, you're not going to beat me up. And they sort of have a negotiation in the end, don't they?
Yeah, that's right. And in the end, the rich kid ends up, willing to be generous. Didn't necessarily have to be, but I tried to end things on a positive note there. But that was an exercise, scenarios that I use actually with my officer candidate students. Towards the end of my career, I was an instructor and I was teaching, officer candidates. And it was just scenarios that I would set up in order to get them thinking about, hey, not only how does this work, but what are the incentives behind human behavior? And because as officers, when they end up in country, they tend to they'll eventually get to a point where they manage regions of the world filled with perhaps warring tribes and that sort of thing, and trying to understand those incentives and how to align them in such a way that we have positive outcomes. So again, the whole intent of this is not to advocate for a violent world or violence in any way, shape, or form, but to help folks understand why people become violent in the first place, and then to perhaps align their incentives in such a way that we have a more positive outcome. Yeah, absolutely.
And in the second example of that story, maybe I can think of a way that actually breaks the first law, because maybe the poor kid could have punched the rich kid and then he would have fallen over. Is that potentially effective? But then the rich guy gets back up again and ends up being victorious.
Yeah. So, in that second scenario, he makes an attempt. The poor kid makes an attempt, just like, he had threatened to do in the first scenario, but it wasn't effective. So in that sense, we still have the validity of that first natural law, where he was unable to be effective, whereas the rich kid, in this case, the expert martial artist, was absolutely able to be effective. And so he was the first at being effective, although he wasn't the first to lash out, as the bully. Yeah.
Yeah. And another natural law, which I can't remember word for word, but it's like, it's to do with the distance, really, isn't it? And the way that you can have yourself in a position where you can put violence onto somebody, but they can't put violence onto you, like how an adult would hold out a child on their head.
Yeah. And that is. And so that highlights, the importance of positioning, which is a very subtle. This is something that somebody that has been a martial artist, their whole life gets immediately. And, for professional military service members, if they've been in it for a career, they'll certainly get it, senior officers and senior NCOs. But for somebody just kind of coming into that world, it's something that you can grasp. Everybody is seeing that, adult kind of pushing the forehead away the kid that can't get him. But to understand that actually applies, to the field of combat. If you're behind a wall and your rifle reaches out 1,000 yards and they're out in the open and theirs only reaches 500, they're in a world of hurt. That's a perfect position that you want to be in. And that is the worst position for them to be in. And it's just, to understand how important positioning is, on the battlefield. But again, it applies even outside, that military context. Whenever you have any, in my mind, violence is kind of the penultimate example of a hyper-competitive scenario. And so whenever you have that kind of hyper-competitiveness, I also talk about kind of the markets. So trading in the marketplace, we're talking stocks, options, bonds, that sort of thing. Hyper competitive. Positioning even in those situations is everything. When you get in, when you get out, and how much you've managed, risk dictates, really the outcomes, in the end. So just lessons that really apply to any kind of hyper-competitive environment.
Yeah. And you write a lot, actually, about your own experience in the book, don't you?
Yes. Towards the end, I do try to wrap it up with that. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And kind of show how these things have applied, particularly that kind of right brain, left brain, where, you got to be strict and disciplined, but at the same time, you also have to be compassionate, with yourself and others, and understand there's a human element to all of this. Yeah, absolutely.
And in terms of your experience, have you discovered these natural laws from your experience working in the army and things, or is it more research or maybe a mixture?
No, this is strictly my observations in combat. From my various multiple combat deployments, and it was just something that I grew to observe and kind of really just, I don't want to say document, but it just hit home like, hey, this is the same every battlefield I go to, regardless of what enemy. These mechanics are still how it works. And as you become more senior, you become introduced to these principles of war. It made sense where the Americans and the Brits got their principles of war, but it wasn't explicit in doctrine, in military doctrine. They don't say, hey, these are the principles because of X. It's just presented, hey, these are the principles of war.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what genius came up with these things? How that really isn't explained. And for whatever reason, it was that was really kind of the starting point where I said, there's a reason behind these. I'm not refuting them, but I'm just saying that there's got to be more to the explanation behind these principles of war, and that's where I came up with my observations. Yeah.
And there are 4 natural laws that you've sort of came up with altogether, aren't there?
Yes, that generate about 5 key elements. Within that context.
Do you think that there are more out there, or have you found them all?
No, not at all. I make no claims to this not only being complete. I make no claims to this being correct, and I certainly hope my work is challenged by militaries throughout the world and folks involved in this sort of thing. I would really hope they get fleshed out more. Do I think I've laid a good foundation? Absolutely. But I certainly don't want to be so modest as to claim that I figured it out. No. I've just started the ball rolling. That's it.
Yeah. What's the 4th law that I've forgotten then?
So I talk about time. It was probably the action. You at some point in time. Because the 4th law is technically the positioning one, but the 3rd one that we really haven't talked about was action, and essentially the need for action. Meaning you can't be victorious if you're just sitting there and doing nothing. At some point in time, you do have to take action. So action is a requirement for success in a violent situation.
And I guess some of these laws, maybe people might be thinking they go without saying. It's maybe obvious that you have to fight in a fight to win.
Yes. I know. And I would agree with that. I would completely agree with that. But then it begs the question, then why hasn't anybody else, mentioned these kind of fairly obvious? No, I agree. I would not refute that criticism at all whatsoever. And my only counter is that correct, but it has not been documented, and so that was yet another purpose behind the book. Yeah, absolutely.
I guess that's true. A natural law is a natural law. No matter how obvious it is, it still needs to be in the list.
Yes, absolutely. Discussed and its ramifications kind of fleshed out. So absolutely. Yeah.
And have you got any plans for more books after this one, perhaps?
Not really. I have been asked to ghostwrite, do some other non-related things. I do have a blog, and I can see perhaps where I tell some of my war stories, and so I could see those maybe at some point in time being amalgamated into a book. But there are no plans at this point in time for a series. And, again, I'm more excited just to get folks talking about, what I've discussed in this book.
Yes, absolutely.
At this point, yeah.
And in the meantime, this is the book, The Natural Laws of Violence. And, it's actually quite a quick read. You could read it in about an hour. So if people are put off, then they don't need to be, because it's only an hour. Where can we find the book if we're interested in it then? Yeah,
so it is on Amazon, UK. And, again, Natural Laws of Violence, Michael Nolan, and it comes up pretty easily. But that's the main vendor is Amazon.
Great. Well, thanks very much for coming on today. It's been great to have you on the show.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate it. Appreciate your time very much.